Ah, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1509, and is entitled The Gay Chronicles of the Monks and Nuns, and it is written by Joseph McCabe. You will notice something different about my videos from now on. I'll be medicating the whole way through. Today, our medicine of choice is cheesy OG sauce. It's very good. Okay. All right. Now let's get ourselves situated here and ready. Now let's see, does this book have a copyright date? Nope, no copyright date. Okay. The Gay Chronicle of the Monks and Nuns, written by Joseph McCabe. In the debunker for April of 1929, Lloyd E. Smith tells how the Reverend S. Parks Cadman recently defended the virtues of the monks. The question was, is it true that, as stated by E. Heidelman Julius, a writer, the monastic lives of the monks were led in filth? The pertinent and impertinent part of the answer is, I do not know who E. Heidelman Julius is, but he shows his ignorance when he makes a statement of that kind. With the morals of Mr. Cadman, who quite clearly first took the words about the monks from Mr. Heidelman Julius's book and garbled them, then said that he did not know who Mr. Heidelman Julius was, and thirdly remarked that the naughty epithets really applied to Mr. Heidelman Julius himself, with whose work he seemed to be painfully familiar. I am not concerned, but Mr. Heidelman Julius seems to think that I know a little about monks, and he has asked me to give my customary courteous attention to the cleric, and here it is. A week after receiving this copy of the debunker, let me say by way of introduction, a correspondent sent me a charming little history of the body of English monks to which I once belonged. He had visited my old monastery, seen the sweet, edifying life of the penitents, and received this pious souvenir as he left. It was written by one of the monks. And it concentrated a quite remarkable amount of the odor of sanctity in a few pages. The friars, who have died within the last 20 years, were positively embalmed in virtue. One merely wondered why the English cities they had so long made fragrant with their virtues did not witness countless miracles. So my correspondent wanted to know if I knew the monk writer and the saintly monks he described. I sure do. I have seen most of them slightly drunk, and a man does not hide much then. The writer of the book himself figures very prominently in my 12 years in a monastery. He twice bolted from the very friary in which I lived in London, and though on one occasion he thoughtfully took with him the large special collection we had just made in church, he was starved into surrender and returned. So it appears that he is still teaching Catholic truth. The dead friars whom he canonizes were boozers almost to a man. Of one of them, his own superior, a strict man, this, told me that if you put whiskey before him and swore you would shoot him if he touched it, he would drink it. And he generally got his whiskey in the homes of Catholic women while their husbands were at work. All of these friars kept bottles in their own rooms, besides the communal potions every week. A number of them had their names copied with those of women. They were, as a body, stupid, sensual, and in some degree or other hypocritical. Not 1 in 10 had any deep religious feeling. Thus are Roman Catholics doped with Catholic truth, and then forbidden to read more. Oh, and then forbidden to read me. If this is conventional virtue in the lands of heretics in the 20th century, and though my book still, after 30 years, sells numbers of copies annually, there has never been the least reply to it. You will be fairly well prepared to hear the sad story of the monks of the Middle Ages. Let me first repeat what my friend Mr. Hademan Julius does say in his Outline of Bunk, and if you will see that I justify every line of it. Criticizing a previous attempt of the Reverend Cadman to curry favor with Roman Catholics, so large a body of our fellow citizens, etc., by talking bunk about the monks, he said, "The facts are that monasticism was the most noxious weed of medieval ignorance, that those monks were stupid, superstitious, and terribly opposed to all culture and humanity, that they lived in a crazy, cruel, and filthy manner, that no single virtue could be ascribed to them, save that they withdrew from the common world to practice their insanity. I am prepared to dot every I and cross every T in that. It does not mean that there never was a saintly monk, but that the saintless, where it existed, had other vices and repulsive practices. Nor that there never was a learned monk, but that the learned was always peculiar, and much of it pernicious. It means that from the time the plague came into Europe, the monks were generally ignorant, slothful, and sensual, and that precisely where they strictly followed their rules, their ideal was a superstition, and their lives generally worthless to the race. It happens that I am just going to begin a very thorough history of the Church of Rome, with full references, so that I need not here give more than general references to the Christian writers of every age whom I'm going to quote. It was in the year 341 A.D. that the fiery and rather unscrupulous Saint Athenaeus, whose famous creed Mr. Shaw says ought now to have the additional and final clause, and I believe that Athenaeus was a damned fool, brought to Rome the first 2 monks that ever appeared in it. They came, as you will be aware, from a vast colony that peopled the Egyptian desert and overflowed into contiguous lands. That it was a wonderful and unique invention of Christian piety that men and women should forswear the comforts of home and city in order to keep their virtue intact is, of course, nonsense. There were, when the Egyptian epidemic began in the second half of the 3rd century, Buddhist monasteries all over Asia. There had several centuries earlier been celibate communities in Egypt and Judea. Earlier still, there had been Pythagorean communities in Italy, Janist monasteries of the strict type in India, and so on. The world had been steadily developing the disease of asceticism for 1,000 years. But there were 2 or 3 distinctive features of this Christian asceticism. Yes, let us be quite just and candid, and let the Reverend Cadman have fair play. The new monks went far beyond all their pagan predecessors. They defiled stinking filth, gross ignorance, and murderous fanaticism. The poor devils could not be trusted by their superiors to have a bath, and Egypt is pretty warm. Some, out in the desert, even wore no clothes, but their abnormally developed hair, and they crawled over the rocky ledges like new types of beast. Some lived on the top of columns, not even coming down for sanitary purposes. Simeon Stylites lived 30 years on the top of a high column, and we can quite easily believe the pious ladies who came to pray at the foot of the column, that he stank even at 60 feet. His legs were ulcerated, and when the worms fell out, another monk was directed to put them back again. The father of them all, Anthony, lived to be more than 100, yet boasted that he had never washed his feet. The Virgin Sylvia, though 60 years old and diseased from her filth, never washed more than her fingers. When 50,000 of these beauties met for a common service on Easter morning, I should imagine you could have cut the odor of sanctity with a knife. Yes, let us grant the Reverend Cadman his heroism of virtue. I am only sorry that he had not the privilege of living in ancient Oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus. Oxyrhynchus, where 30,000 monks and nuns who never bathed exhaled their virtues. You will find pages of this stuff in Lecky's History of European Morals, with references to the lives of the saints, so I need not linger. But Lecky says very little about the other distinctions of Christian monks. They were mostly ex-slaves or poor workers, so perhaps the dirt felt homely. When one did not aim at all, So perhaps the dirt felt homely, when one did not aim at the exalted holiness of Anthony and Simon. And when I ponder a little, I am not sure that the rigorous sacrifice of all knowledge which they made, the one vow to which they were all faithful, would really be very erroneous to them. Unfortunately, conviction is generally strongest when knowledge is least, and these swarms of tens of thousands of monks terrorized whole cities. Often their leaders displaced bishops, who were occasionally murdered, and treated even archbishops with appalling violence. You should read about the council at Ephesus in the year 449, where crowds of these odoriferous creatures dictated to the bishops at the point of the knife what was real truth about the nature of Christ, or how in the 5th century these fierce fanatics with violence and bloodshed compelled the church to agree that Mary was the mother of God. But you probably know how they tore the flesh from the bones of the venerable Hypatia, which is only one episode in their long reign of violence. I will not say confidently that one might not find something remotely approaching this violence in the history of the monks of Tibet, but let us not be punctilious. Yeah. Cadman can have them. They were sufficiently unique in their virtues. This, perhaps, he will tell his docile world, was the fiery East, where hot blood flushes the imagination and makes exaggeration and passion natural. To test monasticism, we must turn to the tranquil West, to the sober Benedict, and learned Cassiodorus, to the industrious abbeys, which preserved agriculture and letters and created a new art. Very well, Mr. Cadman, but before we leave the East for the West, let me remind you of another commonplace of Christian literature. Now that historians have more or less taken the public into their confidence, we all know that Europe did not bloom with new virtues when it became Christian. We know, in fact, that it passed into a phase of appalling squalor and violence. And the new apologetic is that, unfortunately, the Goths and Vandals fell upon Europe just at the time when Christianity courted it. We are, in fact, now asked not to look for the real fruits of Christianity in Europe, so we suppose that, since these northern barbarians never disturbed the Eastern Roman Empire, which included Egypt, its real fruits are to be sought there. And quite the most conspicuous in this fungoid growth of monks and hermits in Egypt and Syria, spreading gradually as far as the navel contemplating monks of Greece. As to the fiery blood of the East, this also is bunk. The historical fact is that Alexandria, near which the most violent army of the monks lived, was the most sober and progressive city of the Old World. It had not only succeeded Athens as the metropolis of learning, but it had opened up the avenue of science, and would, if cultures had not been extinguished, have inaugurated a birth civilization centuries ago. Pardon me. So that in fact your mob of howling savage monks inflicting a ghastly death on the learned Hypatia, and then going on to destroy the whole culture of the city, are a very fit symbol of what the world owes to monasticism. However, let us see what really happened in Europe. Vows of chastity were of course quite well known in the Roman Church before Athenius brought his freaks to entertain the city. Council after council from the year 305 onward had some very ugly words to say about celibate priests who had spiritual sisters living in their homes. One of the first effects of the visit of the monks was to encourage this practice. To monasticism of the odoriferous Egyptian type, even the Christians of Rome did not take kindly. Their life, said the Christian orator Lactanius, was the life of beasts, not of men. But there was a great growth of sacred virgins. Even noble ladies of Rome in their palaces on the Aventine vowed themselves to virginity, and I have no doubt that the Reverend Cadman would tell us that the presence in Rome of this Aventine school of holiness in the second half of the 4th century is an unquestioned fact. Well known from the letters of St. Jerome to the young ladies, quite so. But even Mr. Cadman may have wondered sometimes why these precious letters of Jerome have never been translated, or only partially, into English, and since he probably does not read Latin, I will tell him. Because they depict the conditions of the Christian world in Rome, a few decades after contact with the saintly monks of the East, as one of gross immorality and hypocrisy. It is true that Jerome praises the high virtue of his aristocratic pupils, less than a dozen in all, but he has to warn them to preserve their virtue. They must have nothing to do with the priests and sacred virgins of Rome. He does not say that some of these are loose, but that they quite generally are. I will give passages from his letters in my forthcoming book, and will here repeat only what he says about the fervor for virginity which the monks have inspired in Rome. He calls it a plague, and says that the women are simply a new genus of concubines. He scorns the pretense that they live spiritually with the priests and monks, and sometimes, he says, occupy spiritually the same bed with them. In other words, the first crop of nuns, as we may call them, on European soil was within 20 years totally corrupt. The heretiae of Greece are usually mentioned with horror in Christian literature, though more learned Hellenists are not at all agreed about their characters. But the very witness to the virtue of half a dozen Roman virgins is just as empathetic about the vice and hypocrisy of all the others and of the clergy. The heretiae must not be mentioned in the same breath as this first lot of Mr. Cadman's nuns. We do not know much about the first crop of monks in Rome and Italy. The usual story is that the beautiful idea slowly captured the hearts of the Romans, worn and weary from vices, etc., and that the monks were so numerous and so conspicuous for their virtues by the year 370 that a saintly bishop from Gaul, St. Martin of Tours, visiting Rome in that year, borrowed a few to take back to Gaul, that the fragrant plant again grew so rapidly that 2,000 monks marched at the funeral of St. Martin, that they sent colonies to England, Ireland, and Scotland, and that in a century or two the whole of Western Europe was covered with monasteries, some containing more than 1,000 monks, where learned and classical literature were preserved, where virtue and refinement found shelter from the violence of the barbarians. And I think we'll stop there with part 1 of the gay chronicles of the monks and nuns. And we'll see you in part 2.